Hi everybody, David here with Via Render. Thanks for taking the time to check out this Lumion 2023 video. So, Lumion 2023 has been out for a few weeks right now, and in this video, I want to talk about what I think you need to know if you're thinking about using it, or if you're thinking about, paying that fee to go from 12.5 to 2023, or if you're just thinking of bringing in the Lumion 2023 version into your current workflow. And this is not a video on the new features per se, or why you should use Lumion or why you should use another software. It's more specifically just the things that I think you should know about when it comes to the current version of Lumion 2023. Okay, everybody. So before we get into it, I want to take a quick look at our little scene here. And we've got a pretty simple, straightforward SketchUp build. And this is kind of like the type of scenes that I really like doing. They're very simple, and they can kind of do things with like push materials and lighting. And so it's a relatively straightforward one. And this brings me to point number one. Bouncing over to Lumion, you can see how the materials and things are set up. My first tip would be if you've got projects from the older versions of Lumion. So for example, I have some older student projects from 12.5, and you're thinking about bringing them into Lumion 2023 to hit the ray trace button and just make things look amazing. Well, don't. Quite simply, they will not translate very well. Now, the people over at Lumion have been very clear about this, and this is good advice for just like any software when you make a sort of generational leap. Older projects, you are better off finishing them before you bring them over. This was also something that the users of D5 using version 2.3 who jumped to 2.4 ran into as well. So when in doubt, finish your current work with your current workflow using the current version of the software that you're using. And this is very true for the jump to 2023 as well. Quite simply, projects do not translate very well. Now, the exterior projects, that is a little bit different. Those will translate to a point, but there are still lighting differences. And one major difference will be in the use of foliage, how foliage will actually look. The rasterization engine in 2.3 has, in fact, been updated too. And so you will see differences. It will quite simply just look different. Now, if you're thinking of bringing interiors over, you're going to run into some problems too. Because of the way ray tracing works, a lot of the older mechanisms that we would have used for lighting scenes, so for example, using a omni light or a light fill or area lights and then multiple spotlights, all of that becomes effectively a little redundant, and lighting is its own issue that we'll get to in a second. So the first tip, if you're thinking of bringing your projects over to 23, don't just finish them up. All right. Now, with that being said, let's jump into our discussion about the ray tracing. Okay, everybody. So I've gone ahead and set up a pretty simple shot right here. You can see on the left, I have the ray traced version. And on the right here, number 3, I've just got an older style raster image. Now, if you've been using Lumion for a while, you're probably aware that the interiors have been a bit of an issue going forward. You could do really good interiors, but they required a lot of work. You had to be very mindful of things like hyperlight. If you wanted to use global illumination, you could. You had to be cognizant of the shadows, color correction, artificial lights. It was very much an art as opposed to a science. And overall, sometimes the results just didn't look as good as they did in other rendering programs. And, ray tracing is a way to fix this. It's not a catch-all for everything, though. Okay, let's just go over to the ray tracing component, and I'll explain my experience over the last couple of weeks trying to figure this system out and hopefully give you a few tips and pointers, and also explain some of the issues I've run into really trying to bring my student projects into the ray trace mode. And as like I said in the previous section, don't do that. Just literally start from scratch. But by doing that, I have learned a few little things, and hopefully they'll help you out. All right, everybody. So the first thing you need to be mindful of is that ray tracing will supplant a huge amount of the other FX in your FX stack. Quite simply, ray tracing is going to make a lot of the older workflows, particularly using things like hyperlight or the shadow settings, or if you even used to use global illumination, which strongly don't recommend you do, but a lot of that has now become redundant, as has the use of reflection planes as well, which is something we used to have to spend a bit of time setting up and tweaking. Quite simply, ray tracing overwrites all of those. It is a more, if you will, mathematically accurate depiction of light and shadow. And the easiest way to actually turn this on is just go up to the interior RT. That'll be available under custom styles and click on it. Now, by default, the ray tracing setting has a number of these little things set up. These are the standard FX. I'm going to turn off the clipping plane and chromatic aberrations. I don't really know why chromatic aberrations is on this. I know it is meant to give it a more photographic quality, but for a lot of us, we would just do that in Photoshop anyway. All right, so just turn those off. Now, in my scene right now, I'm using just a bog standard real sky. I'll get to this in a second, but I've positioned so the light is coming really through here on the left and is bouncing around the scene. I'm trying to avoid a lot of direct lighting. Okay, I'll come back to the real skies in a second because it does matter. All right, under the actual ray tracing, quite simply the default standard, and if you load up the sort of the practice example scenes, the number of samples is actually set to 512. Now you can take this all the way up to like over 2,000. I don't recommend you do this. You can see in the updating preview down here, it's actually going to run through that 2,000 times as it works out basically how the light should act and behave. And that is quite a lot. What I'm going to be recommending to my students going forward is to keep the number of samples at 16. Now, it's really, really low. It's the lowest possible value, but the time it takes to update the preview is about comparable to what you would have gotten using the older rasterization workflow, which is, kind of about 1 or 2 seconds, maybe a little bit more. Now, you can already see it looks way, 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 way better, but just be mindful of that. Keep the samples as low as possible. Now, bounces is going to determine the amount of, really how often the sort of, if you will, the fake rays or pseudo kind of bounce of light you get. And I've just found just leave this at 8. You kind of do want as much lovely bounciness as you can get with your light, because that's what's going to give rise to those really beautiful color bleed and sort of global illumination. So just leave it at 8. You can also make sure the denoiser is just always on. This form of ray tracing, and Lumion mentions this in their documentation, does result in a lot of noise. Quite simply, you can see it here in the preview. You just have to turn on the denoiser. You couldn't use this otherwise. So really just leave that on. All right. I haven't noticed a huge amount of fireflies either, so I've not really toggled with this at all. Now, I should also point out, this is very comparable to what you'll see if you use the very low settings on the path tracer. That is basically the twin motion path tracer. So they're about visually similar. At the end of this, I will do a comparison where I will show you kind of how things look on small rendered scenes, just something simple like this without a huge amount of information. And I'll show you what basically 16 and then, 512 and then over 1,000 samples looks like. And we can take a look at those. You can see here, after the preview updates, we do have a histogram. It's a visual representation of the lights, midtones, and darks within your image. You have the ability to clamp them here, and this is something that a lot of people on YouTube have talked about, but not really, I think, explained very well how this functions. So The blues are going to be the shadows, basically the areas that are probably too dark or going into very dark levels. And the reds here will be the highlights, effectively where the image is blown out. So I'm going to move my mouse here. I'm going to let this update. And you can see, again, very low samples. And there we go. With these turned on, I'm getting a visual prompt or cue of the areas that would need adjusting. Now, because my shadows are kind of getting dark here, I'm going to go to, we have options here for the overall exposure, which we'll come to in a second. We have options for the highlights, midtones, and shadows. I'm going to lift up my shadows a little bit. And I'm going to take this up and just see now if this gets rid of the areas that really Lumion had sort of seen as being problematic. And you can see that it has. I'll lift these up again a little bit more. And my understanding is you want to work with trying to get this to where you get rid of all the reds and blues. Now, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to get rid of all of the red or blue in your shot. And you may end up having to do things like really adjust the exposure to really brighten up your scene. You could also just bring this into Photoshop and do it in Photoshop, but generally it's understood that it make it look as good as possible in your rendering program, kind of like how a photographer wants their pictures to be as good as possible while you're taking the photo, and so you don't have to worry about it in post. Now, the other thing that you need to be mindful of here is the importance of the auto exposure button. Now, you can see when I turn this off, the image gets just completely dark. I'm going to turn off the clipping for the red and the blue, so basically the highlights and shadows. I'll turn them off and you can see what's going on here. With the auto exposure off, and the auto exposure is a new thing for 23, you can see how dark this image actually gets. Now, I have not yet figured out whether it's better to turn off the auto exposure and then go to your skies and get your sky to blast in as much light as you can as possible and rely on that to light your scene, or do we just leave the auto exposure on? And so you can see now if I go back here to the color correction and I turn on the auto exposure, you can just see right there in front of you, it's just brightening up the entire image. My gut right now in this current version, the kind of, which is I think the most up-to-date version of the 23, is leave auto exposure on and then you, the user, go in and tweak the settings to see what looks best. So you can go ahead and take the exposure down a little bit and raise up the individual levels. The next thing I think you need to be mindful of is some of the known limitations for ray tracing within Lumion 23. The first is that glass and water, as they currently stand or as they stood in previous versions, is not supported. That means you have to do a little bit of a sort of workaround to get it to work. Here we have an object. This is our pampas decorative plant, and I have an object here that I wanted to assign glass to. So normally, you would just send this over from SketchUp. And Lumion would understand that if it had a glass material, it is supposed to be glass. That's not going to work in this case. So what we have to do is actually select the object, and we can go to Materials and click Standard. And when we do that, let me just pop back over here. I'm going to double click here. We'll have some of the newer materials, and I'm not, these are sort of the new material or PBR setup. I'm not going to go through all of this. But please note that to get a glass material, you'll have to turn all of these off, put them to 0. You will have to crank the reflectivity and metalness all the way to the top, and then use the opacity slider here to effectively determine the see-throughness, if you will, or transparency, of your glass material. So without the opacity, with reflectivity at 200 and metalness at 200, you have a mirror material. By adding opacity to it, adding transparency to it, you're converting it into a pseudo or fake glass material. And overall, I think it does, looks pretty good. I do know that this is going to be addressed going forward, and I suspect it will be one of the priorities for the Lumion developers is to fix up glass, because ultimately everyone wants, those really nice fancy ray traced reflections. And to get that, they want, you kind of will have to get this working properly. But just beware that for the time being, it's a little bit more challenging. But once you know what you need to do, it's pretty easy to convert objects into glass. And from back here, I know the setting's quite low. The glass may not look amazing, but honestly, it'll work for interior shots. Okay, everybody. Just one or two more things that I want to mention before we call it for today. The next thing that I think you should know about is the change to lights. So a lot of the lights now are finally more representative of real world values. So one of the issues with Lumion in the past used to be that the lights were very, very, very strong in their default state, like just really overly pronouncedly strong. This shift to updating the internal lighting, and more specifically, I guess, the internal logic of the lights, is that they are based on real-world values now. So, for example, I've added 2 lights to this basic scene, and I've cranked them up to about 3,000 lumen. Now, the older Lumion, that would have been like just ridiculously high. You would have lit up an entire building with that. But, somewhere between 1,000 to 3-ish thousand lumen is sort of, I believe, standard for interior lights. So it's a much more realistic sort of measurement for lights. And they still use the really nice IES light profiles, and you have lots of them, which is really fantastic. And you can load up your own, which has always been kind of cool. For those of you that have like IES light profiles just lying around. The other thing is we no longer necessarily have to light our scenes using a whole pile of arbitrary lights. You don't have to add light fills and omni lights just like dotted around the room to add extra light. And I think this is very much a good thing. Lights have actually become more simplified, and you use them now, I think, in a more logical fashion. In other words, you're not going to have these like floating spotlights in the ceiling just because you need a light that gives you shadows. Or you don't have to have omni lights just magically floating in around the room because, again, you needed the shadows that they casted. As it currently stands, shadows will be casted by light sources and primarily your whatever sky you're using. And so, again, it's a much more intelligent use of light and a much better way to light your scenes. The last thing I think you should know if you're thinking of utilizing Lumion 2023 or thinking of introducing it into your workflow is the change in pricing structure. Prior to the advent of sort of Lumion 23, the cost for a professional license to use commercial work in the US for a single pro license seat was about 3,600, if memory serves. That was staggeringly expensive, and very cost prohibitive in many ways. Now, the flip of this is I do love that Act 3D and Lumion is available to schools like mine for free. In fact, there's no way I would have been able to run architectural visualization classes without access to Lumion's free student edition, because they were doing that, I think, before even Twinmotion and, many years before D5 even came around. And some of the other rendering programs out there had an EDU or educational version, but you still had to pay for it. Now, you could argue there's a lot of reasons why you would do this, and in many ways, like Autodesk, it's obviously an attempt to catch people while they're in college and school, get them using your software, and then they'll go on to use it professionally. And, as long as you're not under any illusion about that, it doesn't really matter. It's still really, really good. Now, the price drop is massive too. The actual commercial drop from really, 3,600 to 1,300 is a staggering drop in price. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. Competition in the market has definitely increased. And I think there was a concern that, companies and firms just could not afford that. Single users like, smaller companies like this, like VRender, can't really afford that. And so this price drop makes it a lot more competitive. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here is support. Quite simply, Axe 3D and Lumion have got really some of the best support that you're ever going to get. Now, I'll give an example of this to emphasize. And please understand that I think a lot of what Lumion is targeted for is towards firms and companies. Now, many full architects or architectural rendering firms or visualization firms, if you're an architect, you probably don't have a background in 3D. You probably didn't spend time doing 3D art. You had, architectural stuff to worry about. And you have to remember, Lumion is very much, it's an architectural rendering software. It is meant for people who are not 3D artists or 3D visualizers or 3D generalists. It's meant to be user accessible and easy to pick up and to get rapid results. And so in many ways, you're paying for that. You're paying for the luxury of ease of use and ease of learning so that you could produce images of a high enough quality, but you could produce them without a hugely technical background. I do want to give a shout out to support again. We ran into an issue recently on this channel where a Lumion video that I had done, which was actually a users leaving Lumion and going to D5 render video, was flagged for copyright. Now, this was kind of a bit of a surprise to me, and the video got taken down by YouTube, which was a bit of a shame because I think at the time it had about 7-ish thousand views, which was the most watched of my videos. So it was a bit of a blow to have a copyright notice. Now, my initial impression was that this is because, this is a private company and maybe they were very litigious. But I sort of interpreted it as a big company going after a very small voice on the internet. And I actually reached out to Act 3D about this and asked them if they could explain. And they got back to me with really one of the nicest, most informative, and most genuine responses that I'd ever gotten from any company. And explained what was going on was sort of out of their hands and due to an issue with a third-party piracy sort of checker thing that they were utilizing. Yeah, it was an unbelievable response, and they literally took steps to get it resolved, which is really, really nice. And the type of thing that you might not get with a lot of other softwares out there. Even though you may be very much paying for support, I don't know that you get that level of support. In saying that, you can't blindly show adherence to companies, and we have to acknowledge there is a price issue still that remains, and Lumion is still quite expensive. Even though it's more affordable now, it is still expensive. And the question going forward for you as a potential user or somebody currently thinking about jumping from 12.5 to 23 is it worth it? Yeah, I think there's just a lot to love about this, and I think it is only going to get better. And there are also understandable criticisms. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Again, this video was just on the things I think you need to know about Lumion 23 to get you started. It's not going to be everything. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.